Thank you very much. Good to see you all. Just a couple of things I wanted to pick up on. One, you've already had the declaration where both Danny and I are co-chairs of the APPG on philanthropy. And just a point of information, we think from the report that we published last year, some minor changes could unlock nearly between £6 to £7 billion to the social economy. So we would very much appreciate a follow-up conversation on some of those ideas. They're pretty straightforward. The point about advice is really key as well. So moving on, first of all, to you, Minister Atkins. You mentioned earlier about the Office of Tax Simplification, that you felt that there's a risk of having a separate independent institution with the expertise, credibility, all the things that that we find valuable, but there is a risk that ministers might just sort of not be engaged. But that logic then follows that other agencies should be brought in-house as well, does it not? And how does that figure? The fact that we have an OBR, the fact that we have other institutions that give us advice, do you want to bring them all in-house? Because you might not, as ministers, you might palm off responsibility to them. I mean, they provide expertise that will be beneficial to the Chancellor and ministers to help you. So why is it that the one thing you guys have maintained following the Kwarteng Trust's budget fiasco and announcements is this thing that's not going to help you, it's going to actually make it harder for you to do your job?
Well, of course, the Office for Budget Responsibility has a very, very important role, not of advising us, but of holding ministers to account, of giving you parliamentarians, giving you that independent scrutiny of our budget, and that.
Yeah, sure, but the evidence,
but the scorecarding process is really important.
But I'm giving you an example of the argument follows. There'll be NCA, lots of other agencies that do important work for government ministers. Doesn't mean that ministers. Unless you're saying that ministers are so irresponsible that they're just going to palm off responsibility to others and not take it. And I don't believe you are.
No.
I don't at all in terms of the work that you've done. So it just doesn't make sense. And we have cross-party support. We're going to put up a fight against this decision to hold on to it, because we actually think it's good for you. Unless you are so fearful of accountability and transparency, not you. You've inherited it. You and your colleagues have decided, that's one convenient thing that's one of the few useful things that came out of the Kwasi Trust budget that we should hold on to.
No, I mean, interestingly, the NCA example you gave, of course, they are law enforcement. They have warranted powers. Okay. No minister could ever go anywhere near that.
If I'd known you were going to say what you said, I might have gone back and checked exact parallel institutions that you may that logic follows that you should abolish.
As a Conservative, I think we should always be looking at arm's length bodies and asking ourselves, do they meet the criteria we as taxpayers expect, and what do they deliver? Yeah. And I very much welcome the work across government and indeed via backbench colleagues to look at regulations and those who regulate them. It does
smack of not wanting transparency and accountability, not wanting to have that support. But I've got a number of questions, so let's move on.
Just on that point, though, the Treasury of all the departments, we have 2 fiscal events a year at least where we are open to scrutiny. Okay. And that, I'm sure, is how you will decide
but the context
in terms
of that
our
budget and the way in which the OBR was being undermined during that budget, this institution, the announcement was made to abolish it in the context of not wanting accountability. In the current, I'm not saying you and your colleagues, the new Chancellor and others are, obviously we've seen a rowing back in terms of a bonfire on institutions that give independent advice and so on. But that's the context in which this decision was made, and it's concerning that you've continued, you and your colleagues, including Chancellor, have decided to maintain that decision. But that is you're in power and it's your prerogative. But we don't think this is helpful and it benefits you and the country. Just turning to a related point, which is to do with evidence, to do with expertise. We've heard from the Public Accounts Committee last month that billions, have lost to fraud. 5.5 billion before the pandemic went up to 21 billion. Again, and then we've heard earlier from the chair about the challenges that the HMRC is facing. and what you're trying to do there, there does seem to be a real kind of issue about the chipping away of resources and expertise that could be beneficial, actually, in terms of making sure that in the process of providing tax, new forms of taxes and so on, that fraud doesn't happen within those, or new reliefs. And once again, it just seems like it's not going to help removing these sorts of institutions in order to bear down on fraud, for instance. I just wondered if you had a view on it, or does it not matter at all? Does it not matter? Do you feel that, actually that's a completely separate point, and it is just down to HMRC and what they need to do to deal with tax fraud, given the numbers are so high now? Does the kind of resource that's has been provided by OTS in the past, does it have any use in that agenda?
I mean, look, His Majesty, Revenue and Customs, and the forms it took before then have always been a giant target for criminal attack. I mean, when I used to prosecute for HMRC/HMCE, as it was, in a single case, I had a single VAT fraud that we were prosecuting that risked altering the GDP of another country because of the way the fraud was committed. It was that enormous, and that was long before I was a government minister, or indeed a member of Parliament, and indeed before the coalition government. So the King's revenue is always under attack, and we find ways of trying to guard against that in the many, many ways that fraudsters try to commit crimes. Indeed, our most popular criminal offence, if you're a criminal barrister, is cheating the revenue. It's a common law offence because we've understood over time the dangers there are of people being able to defraud the taxpayer and defraud the revenue. In terms of the Office of Tax Simplification, in all of my professional career, including long before the OTS was set up, I'm not aware of the OTS playing a particular role in helping law enforcement catch criminals.
No, I know
they can,
of
course, help give us. They have advised in the past, and just because this office has moved, will no longer exist after the Finance Bill is passed, does not mean that work realising where matters can be simplified, but also where the system may come under a criminal attack, that work does not stop. I have teams of fraud investigators looking at that.
We've seen that, and presumably that will be officials in the Treasury now having to do that.
We have, in terms of law enforcement, we have teams of specialist law enforcement officers with warranty powers.
The OTS will be now Treasury officials will have to do that.
Yeah, and rightly so, I think. Rightly so, right. They should think of that.
You've got the capacity to do that.
Yes, very much so. We're as I say, it is now part of our
we were
bread and
assured by
butter.
HMRC just on the fraud side during the pandemic. Do you need more resources? Can you maintain the will the response to the pandemic mean that you're redirecting resources so that you can't bear down on other things like fraud? And we were reassured that wouldn't be the case. And I'm pretty sure I'll have to basing it on memory. Ministers were reassuring us too. But the reality is that actually we are seeing a situation where tax fraud has gone up pretty dramatically. So chipping away at institutions can be unhelpful.
But there is a distinction between law enforcement and advisory work. It's really important. I know
you're a former lawyer.
So it's really
that.
important.
I defer to you on that. But the broader point is about capacity. It's about expertise. It's about advice that helps ministers do your job better, properly. Ministers have a great deal on. And we've seen a huge amount of churn in the last year, sometimes like less than a week or two. So it's that's why stability and continuity in terms of a professional level and official level is really important. Having an independent agency is really. Just on tax monitoring, what ongoing monitoring of costs of the tax reliefs do ministers undertake at the moment?
So we. As I say, we have the evaluation exercises to see what to ensure that they are delivering the effects that we want them to do. But in terms of the costing, and Helen will be able to give more detail on this, but we are able to we've costed 252 of the non-structural reliefs after the May the 2023 release. We don't report on the cost of all reliefs, as we don't necessarily have sufficient information. So, for example, if someone is taking advantage of the personal allowance, we won't necessarily know the details of that, but we very much try to collect the data we can collect, that it is not too burdensome to collect on taxpayers and thus obviously complicate their tax affairs. And so with our multi-year estimates are available for 105 of those non-structural reliefs, which covers around £195 billion of relief in 2021 to 22, which is up from £155 billion in 2018 to 2019. And we know that the biggest 34 reliefs cost over 500 million a year each.
And just one final thing. The OTS said there wasn't a single minister that is responsible for tax reliefs. Do you think there should be one minister, as in multiple ministers?
Oh, I see.
Sorry, clarify.
Right.
Do you think one minister should have overarching responsibility, or do you think it works at the moment?
Well, of course, the Chancellor has overarching responsibility.
He has a lot of responsibility.
He has a lot of responsibilities.
The economy after last year.
He has a lot of responsibilities. But I have responsibility for the overwhelming majority of the reliefs. There are some that the Exchequer Secretary has responsibility for, including, for example, alcohol duty reliefs and EST as well. But I think, between the four of us, or three of us, that is all of the reliefs are covered. And as I said, ultimately it is the Chancellor who has responsibility, and in fairness, in his letter he made that very clear about his commitment to simplification as well as his discussions of tax reliefs. I don't know if there's anything, Andrew.
Thank you, Rushanara.
No.
Thank you. Anne-Marie.
No.